On Christmas Day, my husband poured a drink on me. I have no idea about it. That's what I told the police, the lawyers, and the man I've shared a bed with for 10 years. On Christmas Day, my husband humiliated me in front of the world, and I pretended it never happened. Why? Because if I admit I remember the drink he poured on my face, I have to admit I know about the accident he's planning for me tomorrow. I'm playing the part of the confused wife perfectly. But under this wet silk dress, I'm the one holding the evidence of a murder that hasn't happened yet. California Decembers aren't like the ones in the movies. There's no snow. Just a relentless, golden sun that mocks you, reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows of a house that felt more like a museum than a home. My name is Julia. And on December 25th, at 4:12 p.m., my life as I knew it ended. Not with a scream. Not with a bang. But with the sound of ice cubes clinking against glass. We were hosting. We were always hosting. Mark liked the audience. He stood there, the tech visionary of Silicon Valley, holding a glass of 20-year-old scotch. I had spent 6 hours preparing a dinner he didn't help with, wearing a silk dress that cost more than my first car. I asked him, quite softly, if he had remembered to move the offshore transfers for our daughter's trust. The room went silent. Mark's face didn't redden. He didn't yell. He simply turned, looked me in the eye, and tipped his glass. The amber liquid soaked into my hair. It stunned my eyes. It dripped off my chin and onto the white silk. Our friends, the elite of Palo Alto, gasped. I felt the coldness of the ice hit my collarbone. I didn't blink. I didn't wipe it away. I just stared at him. I have no idea about it, I said. My voice was a flat line. No emotion. No tears. Mark looked confused. It wasn't the reaction he wanted. He wanted me to cry. He wanted me to run. But I just stood there, dripping in front of the world, realizing that the man I loved was a ghost I had been chasing for 10 years. Before I tell you how I burned his world to the ground while smiling for the cameras, look at the subscribe button. Some of you will click it because you know what it feels like to be betrayed. But if you're planning to walk away, to leave me standing here in this wet dress without hitting that button, then I want you to go to the comments. Tell everyone why you chose to stay silent while a woman's life was being dismantled. Tell us why you'd rather watch the fire than help build the cage. I'm waiting. Mark laughed then. A nervous, jagged sound. Julia, you're losing it, he told the room. I just tilted my head. Losing what, Mark? I have no idea what you're talking about. That was my first move. Gaslighting a gaslighter is a dangerous game. But I had the home field advantage. As I walked upstairs to change, I didn't go to the master bedroom. I went to the floorboard in the library. The one Mark didn't know was loose. Because, well, he thought he was the only one with secrets. I had been collecting his for years. Upstairs, the silence was heavy. I stood in front of the vanity mirror. The scotch had dried into a sticky, smelling film on my skin. I looked at my reflection and didn't recognize the woman staring back. She looked older. Sharper. I loved him once. Truly. I remembered the days in our studio apartment when we shared a single ramen bowl. Now, we shared a 10,000 square foot tomb. I pulled the hidden ledger from the floorboards. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of the mask finally slipping. For 3 years, I had watched the numbers move. Mark thought he was clever, siphoning funds into an account in the Cayman Islands under a shell company called Lyra Tech. Lyra. That was his ex-girlfriend's middle name. I sat on the floor, the ledger open, the sounds of the party drifting up from downstairs. They were laughing now. Mark was telling a joke. He was charming them, making them forget he had just humiliated his wife. I realized then that if I left him now, I'd leave with nothing. The prenuptial agreement he'd made me sign was ironclad. Unless I could prove the morality clause had been breached. But Mark was careful. He never left a paper trail. Except for the one I had spent 3 years creating. I took a photo of the latest transfer. $200,000 moved just yesterday. On Christmas Eve. While he was kissing me under the mistletoe. I felt a sudden wave of nausea. I ran to the bathroom and hovered over the sink. I didn't throw up. I just stared at the drain. I have no idea about it, I whispered to the porcelain. That was going to be my mantra. Denial wasn't my weakness, it was my weapon. If I pretended I didn't know he was cheating, he would get sloppy. If I pretended I didn't know he was stealing, he would get greedy. I heard the door handle turn. Mark was coming up. I didn't hide the ledger. I didn't move. I just sat there in my ruined dress. I wanted to see the look in his eyes when he realized the stupid wife he just humiliated was the only thing standing between him and a prison cell. Mark entered the room. He smelled like expensive tobacco and victory. He looked at me, still sitting on the floor, and his eyes narrowed. Get up, Julia. You're making a scene by not being down there. People are asking. I looked up at him, my eyes wide and vacant. Asking about what, Mark? Did something happen? He paused. His hand stayed on the doorknob. The drink. I had a slip of the hand. You know I've been stressed. I let out a soft, melodic laugh. It sounded hollow, even to me. A drink? Mark, you haven't had a drink all day. You've been so sober. Are you feeling okay? Maybe the stress is getting to your head. The silence that followed was thick. I watched his brain try to process it. I was denying reality. I was handing him a way out, but in doing so, I was making him question his own sanity. I poured scotch on you, Julia. Your dress is ruined. I looked down at the dark stain on my chest. I looked back at him and tilted my head. It's a design, Mark. High fashion. Don't you remember? We bought this together in Paris. We hadn't. I bought it online while he was at a conference in Vegas. Mark stepped toward me, his face a mask of confusion. Are you having a stroke? I feel wonderful, I said, standing up and smoothing the silk. I feel like for the first time in years, everything is perfectly clear. I walked past him, brushing my shoulder against his. I felt him shiver. As I reached the door, I turned back. Oh, and Mark? Tell Lyra that the transfer didn't go through. Something about a security flag. I'm sure it's nothing. The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. He hadn't told me about the transfer. He hadn't told me about Lyra. And I had just admitted I knew, while claiming I had no idea about the drink. The game had officially begun. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in a house worth $12 million. It isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of weight. It's the sound of the air conditioning humming through hidden vents, the sound of the security system's red eye blinking in the hallway, and the sound of two people breathing in separate rooms, each wondering who will strike next. After the Christmas party, guests finally trickled out, shuffling away with their forced smiles and their whispered gossip about the eccentric Julia. The house felt like a crime scene. Mark didn't come back to our room. I heard him in his study. I heard the clink of a decanter against a glass. Another drink. He was trying to wash away the look I had given him. He was trying to drown the name Lyra before it could take root in the air. I stayed in the guest bedroom at the far end of the wing. I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, watching the moon reflect off the black surface of the infinity pool. In California, even the water looks expensive. I spent that night realizing that my marriage hadn't been a partnership. It had been a long-term heist. Mark hadn't just been unfaithful with his body, he had been unfaithful with our future. Every dollar he funneled to Lyra was a brick taken from the house I thought we were building together. I took out my laptop. The screen's glow felt like a spotlight in the darkroom. Strategy is not about anger. Anger is heat, and heat is detectable. Revenge is absolute zero. I began to map out the geography of his lies. Mark was a CTO. He lived in code. He believed that if you encrypted something deeply enough, it ceased to exist for anyone without the key. But he forgot one thing: I was the one who organized his life. I was the one who knew the names of his childhood pets, the date his father died, and the specific sequence of numbers he used for every mundane password since 2012. I tried his standard string. Access denied. I tried his daughter's birthday. Access denied. Then, I felt a twist in my gut. I typed in, December 25th, Christmas. On the screen were the blueprints for a life I wasn't part of. A condo in Malibu. A lease agreement under a shell company. And photos. Not the kind of photos you'd find in a scandal, these were worse. They were mundane. Mark and a woman with soft hair, laughing at a farmer's market. Mark holding a dog I'd never seen. Mark looking happy. The man who had just poured a drink on my face because I asked about our finances was playing house 40 miles away with my money. As I scrolled, I found a document titled exit_strategy.pdf. My husband wasn't just cheating. He was planning to disappear. He was going to leave me with the debt of the mansion, the tax liabilities of his failing startup, and a vacuum where our life used to be. He was going to do it in 30 days. I closed the laptop. The darkness of the room felt heavier now. I could have called a lawyer right then. I could have screamed. I could have woken him up and demanded an explanation. But I knew Mark. If I confronted him now, he'd use his resources to bury me. He'd frame me as the unstable wife. He'd point to the drink incident, which I had already denied happening, as proof of my mental breakdown. I had to be the ghost in my own home. The next morning, the sun was bright and cruel. I went down to the kitchen. Mark was there, staring at a cup of black coffee. He looked haggard. The visionary looked like he'd been chased by demons all night. "Morning," I said, my voice bright, almost chirpy. He jumped. He actually jumped. "Julia. You're up early." "I have so much to do." I started moving around the kitchen, humming a song he hated. "I'm thinking of redecorating the sunroom. Maybe something in a deep amber? It's such a warm, comforting color." Amber. The color of the scotch. Mark's hand trembled as he lifted his mug. Amber. Right. "Look, Julia, about last night, we need to talk about what you said. About the transfers. And that name." I stopped at the counter, a knife in my hand as I sliced an orange. The citrus scent was sharp. "What name, darling?" "Lyra," he whispered. I turned to him, tilting my head. I gave him a look of pure, concentrated innocence. "Lyra? Isn't that the old Italian currency? Why are you thinking about Italian money, Mark? Are we going to Tuscany?" He stared at me, searching my eyes for a crack. For a glimmer of the woman he could bully. He found nothing. Only a smooth, reflective surface. I thought you said it upstairs," he stammered. "You mentioned a security flag." "Mark," I said, walking over to him, placing a cold hand on his cheek. "I think you're working too hard. You're imagining things. I spent all night thinking about our daughter's college fund. I never said anything about flags. Or Italian money. I leaned in, my lips brushing his ear. I have no idea about it, I breathed. He pulled away as if I'd burned him. He saw the trap, but he couldn't see the edges of it. That's the beauty of psychological warfare. If you tell someone they're crazy often enough, they start to look for the madness in themselves. I watched him grab his briefcase and bolt out the door. He didn't even finish his coffee. As soon as his Tesla cleared the driveway, I picked up his phone, the one he'd forgotten in his haste. He was sloppy. Fear makes people sloppy. I didn't look at his texts. I didn't need to. I installed a small, undetectable mirroring app I'd bought from a gray market site months ago. From this moment on, every word he typed to Lyra, every bank login, every exit strategy update would be sent directly to my redecorating folder. But then, the phone buzzed in my hand. A message appeared on the lock screen. Not from Lyra. From his lawyer. The papers are ready. We serve her on the 30th, make sure the accounts are cleared by then. He was planning to serve me divorce papers in 5 days. He wanted to strip the house and leave me with the husk. I sat at the marble island and finished his coffee. It was cold. Bitter. I had 5 days to move the pieces on the board. 5 days to ensure that when he tried to serve me, he'd be the one standing in the ruins. I looked at the orange I'd been slicing. I hadn't just sliced the fruit, I'd cut deep into the wood of the cutting board. I stood up and went to the garage. Mark had a collection of vintage watches in a safe there. Assets that were off the books. I knew the code. It was our anniversary. Irony is a delicious thing. I opened the safe and looked at the gleaming gold and steel. These weren't just watches. These were his pride. His achievements. I didn't steal them. That would be too simple. I took them to a local jeweler I'd known for years, a man who owed my father a favor. Replace the movements with high-quality fakes, I told him. Keep the real ones in your vault. If anyone asks, I was never here. By the time I got home, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was dismantling him piece by piece, starting with the things he loved most. But as I walked through the front door, I saw a black SUV parked across the street. It hadn't been there before. And the man inside wasn't looking at his phone. He was looking at me. Mark wasn't the only one with an exit strategy. It seemed Lyra had one, too. And hers looked a lot more violent than mine. The black SUV stayed there. It was a predator in the shadows of the eucalyptus trees, its engine silent, its windows like two dark eyes watching my every move. I didn't run. I didn't call the police. In Palo Alto, the police are for the poor, for people like us. Incidents are handled by men in suits with NDAs in their pockets. I walked into the house, my heart a steady, cold drumbeat. I went straight to the surveillance room, the tech hub Mark was so proud of. He thought I only used it to check if the gardener was trimming the hedges. He didn't know I had installed my own firmware months ago. I pulled up the feed for the street. I zoomed in on the SUV's license plate. Whisper, it wasn't registered to a security firm. It was registered to a holding company called Onyx Horizon. I opened my laptop, my fingers flying across the keys. I wasn't just a corporate wife. Before I met Mark, I was an analyst. I knew how to follow the scent of money through a digital maze. Onyx Horizon wasn't just a company. It was a parasite. It was the entity that had been slowly buying Mark's company's debt. My husband wasn't just a cheater, he was a failing businessman. His Silicon Valley visionary status was a house of cards, and he was selling his soul and my future to keep it upright. But that wasn't the betrayal. Not the real one. I found a secondary encrypted partition in the cloud mirror I'd set up on his phone. It was hidden behind a folder labeled Old Family Photos. I bypassed it in seconds. Inside were audio files. Recordings. I put on my headphones. The first thing I heard was the sound of a heavy door closing. Then, Mark's voice. He sounded different. Younger. More desperate. "She's getting suspicious," Mark said. Then, a woman's voice. Smooth. Cold. Like silk over a blade. "She isn't suspicious, Mark. She's bored. There's a difference. Just keep the accident timeline on track. The insurance policy doesn't pay out if there's a whisper of suicide or negligence." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands went numb. They weren't just talking about a divorce. They weren't just talking about Lyra. They were talking about a timeline. An insurance policy. My husband wasn't planning to leave me. He was planning to end me. The room felt like it was shrinking. Every expensive piece of furniture, every curated piece of art, suddenly looked like a weapon. The house wasn't a tomb, it was a trap. I listened to the next recording. "The drink on Christmas," Lyra's voice said, laughing. "That was a mistake, Mark. Too public. You're losing your nerve." "I wanted to break her," Mark replied. His voice was jagged, filled with a hatred I had never seen. "I wanted her to feel as small as I feel every time she looks at the books. She thinks she's so much smarter than me. I want her last memory to be that humiliation." I closed my eyes. I remembered the scotch hitting my face. The sting in my eyes. The cold drip down my neck. I had thought it was an outburst of a frustrated man. It wasn't. It was a rehearsal. It was the first step in painting me as the unstable, alcoholic wife who would eventually trip over the infinity pool railing after one too many glasses of wine. I didn't cry. Anger is a gift. It's a fuel that burns cleaner than grief. I looked at the screen, at the waveform of his voice, and I realized I wasn't just fighting for my money anymore. I was fighting for my life. I looked back at the surveillance feed. The black SUV was still there. Lyra wasn't just his mistress. She was his handler. She was the one who worked for Onyx Horizon. They weren't just taking his company, they were using him to liquidate me. My family's estate, the one my father had left in a trust that Mark couldn't touch unless I was incapacitated. That was the key. I stood up and went to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water. My hand was perfectly steady. I heard the garage door open. Mark was home. Early. Usually, this would have made me nervous. But as I heard his footsteps echoing in the hallway, I didn't feel fear. I felt an icy, crystalline clarity. I picked up the bottle of scotch from the counter, the same bottle he'd used on Christmas. He walked into the kitchen. He looked at the bottle in my hand. He looked at me. "Julia," he said, his voice cautious. "What are you doing with that?" I smiled. It was the most beautiful, terrifying smile I had ever worn. I walked over to him, the glass stopper clinking softly. "I was just thinking, Mark," I said, my voice like honey. "About how much you love this brand. And about how much I have no idea why you'd waste it on my face." He flinched. He tried to laugh it off, stepping toward me to take the bottle. "Let's not start this again. I told you, it was an accident." I pulled the bottle back, just out of his reach. "Of course. An accident. Like the security flag on the Lyra account? Or the black SUV parked outside right now?" The silence that followed was deafening. I watched his eyes dart to the window. I watched the sweat break out on his forehead. You're imagining things, Julia. There's no SUV." I stepped closer, until I could smell the fear on him. "You're right," I whispered. "I'm probably just being unstable." "That's the plan, isn't it? The insurance policy? The accident on the timeline? Mark's face transformed. The mask of the bumbling, stressed husband fell away. His eyes turned cold, flat, and murderous. He didn't deny it. He didn't have to. You should have stayed stupid, Julia, he said, his voice a low growl. It would have been much easier for everyone. He lunged for me. But I didn't move. I didn't have to. Because as his hands reached for my throat, the front door burst open. Not the police. Not Lyra. But 4 men in tactical gear, bearing the insignia of a private investigations firm I had hired 2 months ago, long before the Christmas party. I hadn't just been collecting secrets. I had been building a fortress. And Mark had just walked right into the middle of it. I looked at him, pinned against the marble island by 2 of the men, and I leaned in one last time. I have no idea, I whispered, how you thought you were the predator in this house. I'm standing in a kitchen with a man who wanted to end me, and all I can think about is who's watching. If you're still here, you're part of the story now. You've seen the mask fall. If you haven't subscribed, ask yourself, are you waiting for me to fall? Or are you afraid of what happens when a woman stops being a victim? If you're going to stay silent, go to the comments. Explain why you're rooting for the man with the scotch. I'll be reading. The adrenaline of a confrontation is a liar. It makes you feel invincible, like a goddess of vengeance carved from marble. But when the men in tactical gear hauled Mark out of the kitchen, not to a jail cell yet, but to a secured holding location I had authorized, the silence that rushed back into the house was deafening. I stood in the center of the kitchen, still holding that bottle of scotch. My knuckles were white. The house was empty, yet it felt crowded with the ghosts of the last 10 years. Every anniversary dinner, every I love you whispered before sleep, every plan we made for our daughter, they weren't memories anymore. They were evidence. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The black SUV was gone. The street was empty. The California sun was finally setting, bleeding purple and bruised orange across the horizon. I realized then that I had won the battle, but I had lost my life. Everything I thought I knew about myself, as a wife, as a partner, was a lie. I had been loving a character in a play. And the lead actor had just tried to kill me. I went to the master bathroom. I turned on the shower, letting the steam fill the room until the mirrors were blind. I stripped off the silk dress, the one stained with scotch and betrayal, and I let it fall to the floor. I didn't just wash my body, I tried to scrub the feeling of his eyes off my skin. I stayed under the water until it turned cold. Reflection is a dangerous thing when you've been living in a house of mirrors. I started to wonder, when did I stop being Julia and start being a target? Was it the day we signed the mortgage? Or was I always just a line item in his exit strategy? I stepped out of the shower and wiped a circle into the fogged-up mirror. I looked at my face, raw and pale. And that's when I saw it. A small, black dot in the corner of the ceiling vent. A lens. Mark wasn't just tracking my phone. He was watching me in the one place I thought I was safe. And if he was watching, then Lyra was watching too. I didn't cover myself. I simply looked directly into the camera lens and smiled. If they wanted a show, I would give them a masterpiece. I walked into the bedroom, wrapped in a towel, and sat at my vanity. I began to brush my hair, 100 strokes, just like my grandmother taught me. With every stroke, I buried the heartbreak. I pushed the wife deeper into the dark corners of my mind and let the architect take over. The emotional fallout was over. The mourning period had lasted exactly 45 minutes. Now, the quiet war began. I knew that Mark being held wouldn't last forever. His lawyers would eventually find him, or Onyx Horizon would realize their puppet was missing. I had a window of maybe 6 hours before the counterattack started. I opened my laptop again. I didn't look at the files this time. I looked at the people. Mark's company, EtherTech, was built on a proprietary algorithm for high-frequency trading. It was the golden goose. If I could kill the goose, I could bankrupt the people behind Mark. I could starve the monster that was Lyra. I called my father's old associate, a man named Elias. He was a fixer for the kind of problems that don't exist on paper. "Elias," I said, my voice steady. "I need you to leak the EtherTech source code. Not all of it. Just enough to show the bugs Mark has been hiding." "Julia," Elias's gravelly voice came through the speaker. "That will tank the stock. You'll lose half your net worth in an hour." "I don't care about the money, Elias," I replied, watching my reflection in the dark window. "I care about the vacuum. I want Lyra and Onyx Horizon to find themselves holding a bag filled with nothing but debt." I hung up. I felt a strange, cold thrill. I was burning my own house down to ensure the termites had nowhere to live. But then, my personal phone buzzed. It was a restricted number. I answered it, expecting a threat from Lyra. Instead, it was a voice I hadn't heard in 5 years. My daughter's nanny, the one Mark had fired without explanation. "Julia," she whispered. "Don't go to the bank tomorrow. Mark didn't just clear the accounts. He put something in your name. Something that will make you the lead suspect in a federal investigation. You need to leave the house. Now." I stood up, the towel dropping to the floor. I looked at the camera in the vent. Mark wasn't just trying to kill me physically. He was setting me up to take the fall for his financial crimes. The exit strategy wasn't a disappearance, it was a frame job. I grabbed a bag. I didn't pack clothes. I packed the ledger, the hard drives, and the fake movements from the watches. I looked at the room one last time. The bed we shared. The walls that held 10 years of secrets. "I have no idea about it," I whispered. I wasn't talking about the scotch anymore. I was talking about the woman I used to be. She was gone. And in her place was someone Mark hadn't factored into his equations. I walked out the back entrance, through the kitchen where the smell of spilled scotch still lingered. I didn't take the car. I took the bicycle from the garage, the one I used for morning rides along the coast. It didn't have a GPS. It didn't have a black box. As I pedaled down the darkened driveway, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. They weren't coming for Mark. They were coming for me. My own house was about to become my prison, and I had escaped with seconds to spare. But as I reached the end of the street, a pair of headlights flickered on. The black SUV was back. And this time, it was blocking the only way out. I pulled the brakes on the bicycle. The tires skidded on the gravel, a sharp, biting sound in the California night. The headlights of the black SUV were blinding, 2 artificial suns designed to pin me in place like a moth on a board. For a heartbeat, I considered turning back. Running into the house and letting the sirens find me. At least the police are a known entity. But then I remembered the voice on the phone. "Mark put something in your name." If I stayed, I was walking into a cage he had been building for years. If I went forward, I was walking into the unknown. I chose the unknown. I didn't pedal toward the SUV. I turned the bike sharply and rode straight into the dense thicket of bougainvillea that lined our neighbor's estate. I felt the thorns tear at my skin, a sharp, stinging reality that grounded me. I dumped the bike in the dirt and crawled through the gap in the iron fence. I knew these grounds. I had walked them 1,000 times during neighborhood mixers, sipping Prosecco and talking about property taxes. Now, they were my jungle. I heard the SUV's doors slam. I heard footsteps, heavy, professional, crunching on the gravel I had just left. "She went into the brush," a man's voice called out. It wasn't Mark's. It was deeper, colder. I didn't wait to hear more. I ran. I ran past the darkened pool house, through the manicured rose garden, until I reached the back gate that led to the public hiking trail. My lungs burned. My heart was a frantic bird trapped in my ribs. But my mind was a calculator. I reached the trail and slowed to a fast walk. I needed to disappear, but more importantly, I needed to know exactly what gift Mark had left in my name. I didn't go to a hotel. I didn't go to a friend's. I went to the one place Mark would never look, the 24-hour laundromat in a neighborhood he considered beneath his zip code. I sat in the back of the neon-lit room, the smell of detergent and cheap floor cleaner filling my senses. I opened my laptop and tethered it to a burner phone. I logged into my personal IRS portal using a secondary identity I'd established months ago as a just-in-case. And there it was. A 1099 MISC form filed electronically just 4 hours ago. A payment of $5 million for consulting services from a sanctioned foreign entity. Mark hadn't just framed me for theft. He had framed me for treason. The room seemed to tilt. Treason. Mark hadn't just wanted a divorce. He wanted me erased. If I was convicted of taking money from a blacklisted entity, the government would seize every asset I owned. The trust my father left me would be liquidated. Mark would swoop in as the innocent, betrayed husband, buy back the assets at an auction for pennies on the dollar, and walk away with Lyra into the sunset. It was brilliant. It was surgical. And it was going to be his downfall. I started digging. If Mark had filed that form in my name, he had to have used a digital signature. He had to have a point of entry. I followed the digital breadcrumbs, bypassing the firewalls of EtherTech. I found the smoking gun at 3:14 a.m. It wasn't a document. It was a metadata trail. The filing had been done from a laptop with an IP address located at a boutique hotel in Half Moon Bay. Mark told me he was at a board meeting in San Francisco that day. But I found something else. Something better. Inside the hidden partition of his cloud, there was a deleted audio file. It was a recording of a phone call between Mark and a man with a heavy accent. "The wife is the perfect fall gal," Mark's voice said, sounding breathless, excited. "She's got the family pedigree. No one will believe she didn't know where the money was coming from. Just make sure the final transfer to the Caymans is triggered the moment the FBI knocks on the door." "And the girl?" the man asked. "My daughter is with her grandmother," Mark replied. "She stays out of it." He was willing to orphan our daughter for a payout. He was willing to let her watch her mother be dragged away in handcuffs so he could settle his gambling debts with Onyx Horizon. I felt a coldness settle into my bones that no California sun could ever warm. I didn't just have the evidence to clear my name, I had the evidence to sink the entire ship. But then, the bell above the laundromat door jingled. I didn't look up, but I saw the reflection in the glass of the dryer. It was the man from the SUV. And he wasn't alone. He was holding a phone, and I could hear Lyra's voice on the speaker. "Is she there?" Lyra asked. "She's here," the man replied, stepping toward my table. I didn't close my laptop. I didn't reach for my bag. I simply took a sip of the lukewarm coffee I'd bought from a vending machine. "You're late," I said, without looking at him. The man stopped. He was large, wearing a tactical jacket, his eyes hidden behind a cap. "You have something that belongs to us, Julia. Mark was supposed to deliver the ledger tonight. Since he's unavailable, you're going to hand it over." I turned the laptop screen toward him. On it wasn't the ledger. It was a live broadcast of a countdown timer. "Do you know what happens when that timer hits 0? I asked, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "It's a dead man's switch. Every file I found, the treason, the offshore accounts, the recordings of Lyra planning my accident, it all goes to the SEC, the FBI, and the front desk of the New York Times." The man hesitated. He glanced at the phone in his hand. Wait, Lyra's voice came through, sharp and panicked. Julia, let's be reasonable. Mark is a fool. We can work around him. You want your life back? We can give you that. We can make the charges disappear. I laughed. It was a dark, jagged sound. I don't want my life back, Lyra, I whispered into the phone. That life was a lie. I want the truth. And the truth is, you're currently standing in a laundromat being recorded by 16 different hidden cameras I installed the moment I walked in. I stood up, slinging my bag over my shoulder. Oh, and one more thing. I didn't just set a timer for the files. I set a timer for Mark's holding location. In exactly 5 minutes, the doors will open, and he'll be met by the very people he tried to sell out. He thinks I'm the victim. You think I'm the leverage. But I'm the one holding the match. I walked past the man. He didn't stop me. He couldn't. Because as I stepped out into the night, I saw the blue and red lights flashing at the end of the block. But they weren't for me. They were heading for the boutique hotel in Half Moon Bay. The hunt was no longer on me. The hunt was on them. There is a specific kind of violence in silence. People think that to destroy a man, you have to scream from the rooftops or pull a trigger. But in the world Mark lived in, the world of venture capital, ego, and disruptive tech, the deadliest weapon isn't a bullet. It's a whisper in the right ear. It's a shadow of a doubt on a balance sheet. I was no longer hiding in laundromats. By 8 a.m., I was sitting in the back of a town car I'd hired using a corporate account Mark had forgotten he'd put in my name 5 years ago. I was wearing a charcoal suit and sunglasses that hid the exhaustion in my eyes. I looked like a widow, but I felt like a sniper. Where to, ma'am? The driver asked. The Sand Hill Road corridor, I said. I have a few deliveries to make. Mark's reputation was his armor. He spent millions on PR firms to ensure he was seen as the golden boy of the valley, the man who could do no wrong. He was currently the frontrunner for the Visionary of the Year award. The ceremony was in 3 days. He needed that award to secure the final round of funding that would allow him to pay off Onyx Horizon and disappear. I opened my tablet. It was time to start the minor executions. I didn't release the treason files yet. That was the nuclear option. No, I started with his vanity. I sent a blind carbon copy email to the 3 major tech blogs and the board of directors at EtherTech. Included in the email? The metadata showing that Mark's most recent breakthrough, the one that had spiked the stock price by 20%, had actually been outsourced to a dev shop in Eastern Europe for $50,000. He hadn't built it. He had bought it and slapped his name on it. In Silicon Valley, being a criminal is sometimes forgiven. Being a fraud who can't code? That's a death sentence. As I watched the sent notification flicker on my screen, I felt a vibration in my pocket. It was Mark's work phone, the one I'd mirrored. A text came through from his lead developer. Mark, the board is calling an emergency session. Someone leaked the GitHub logs. They know about the outsource. Where are you? I watched through the mirrored phone as the panic set in. Mark was currently in a safe house provided by his lawyers, trying to figure out how I had escaped. He didn't know I was the one pulling the strings of his company from the back of a sedan. I watched his reply, deny everything. Tell them it was a hack. I'm on my way. I leaned back against the leather seat. He's moving, I whispered to myself. He was going to the office. He was going to walk into the lion's den, thinking he could charm his way out of it like he always did. He thought his only problem was a scorned wife. He didn't realize that his scorned wife had already poisoned the water he was about to drink. My next stop was the jeweler. I walked into the shop, and the owner, Mr. Henderson, met me in the back room. On the velvet tray sat the movements of Mark's vintage watches, the real ones. You're sure about this, Julia? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. These are worth a fortune. Selling them off market like this. I don't want the money, Henderson, I said, sliding a list across the table. I want you to donate the proceeds from the sale to the 3 charities Mark has publicly snubbed over the last year. Make sure the donations are made in his name. And make sure the receipts are sent to the press. It was a move of cinematic irony. Mark was about to be accused of financial fraud, and suddenly, millions of dollars of unaccounted-for assets were being donated in his name to charities for battered women and financial literacy. It looked like a confession. It looked like he was trying to buy his way into heaven before the gates of hell closed. I walked out of the jeweler's, and for the first time in days, I took a deep breath of the salt air. But then, my burner phone rang. A video call. I answered it. The screen stayed dark for a second, then a face appeared. It wasn't Mark. It wasn't Lyra. It was a man I recognized from my father's funeral. The man who sat on the board of Onyx Horizon. You're playing a very dangerous game, Julia, he said. You're devaluing an asset we've invested heavily in. If Mark falls, we lose money. And we don't like losing money. I didn't flinch. I looked into the camera, my face as still as a statue. Then you should have picked a better horse to bet on, I said. Mark is a sinking ship. I'm just the one who opened the valves. We can make you an offer, the man said. Give us the ledger. We'll take care of Mark ourselves. You get to keep the house. You get to keep your innocence. Stop the leak, and we stop the SUV. I looked at the window of the town car. I could see a silver sedan following us now. They were always there. A constant reminder that I was breathing on borrowed time. I have a better offer, I said. You withdraw your support for Mark. You testify that he was the one who initiated the offshore transfers. Do that, and I might forget to include Onyx Horizon's name in the files I send to the SEC at noon. The man laughed. It was a sound like dry leaves. You have 10 minutes to decide, Julia. After that, the accident timeline moves up. I looked at the driver. Change of plans. Take me to the EtherTech headquarters. If I'm going to have an accident, I'm going to have it in front of a live audience. As we pulled up to the glass and steel monolith that was Mark's empire, I saw the news vans already gathering. The minor execution had worked. The blood was in the water. I saw Mark's Tesla pull into the executive garage. He looked frantic. He looked broken. I opened my door and stepped out. I didn't hide. I walked straight toward the main entrance, where the cameras were. I had 10 minutes before Onyx Horizon tried to kill me. It was time to make sure my death, or my victory, was the most watched event in the history of the valley. The glass doors of EtherTech headquarters are designed to be intimidating. They are 12 feet tall, polarized to reflect the world back at itself, and guarded by men whose only job is to keep the unworthy out. To Mark, this building was a cathedral built to worship his ego. To me, today, it was a courtroom. As I stepped onto the plaza, the scent of expensive cologne and ozone hit me. The reporters swarmed. They didn't know the full story yet, they only knew the blood I'd dropped into the water at 8 a.m. They wanted to know about the outsourced code. They wanted to know why the CEO's wife was arriving alone, looking like a storm cloud in a designer suit. Mrs. Sterling. Is it true the board is asking for Mark's resignation? Julia. Any comment on the Lyratech leaks? I didn't stop. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on the elevator bank. My security pass still worked. Mark, in his arrogance, hadn't deactivated it yet. He still thought he could manage me. He still thought I was the woman who would freeze when he poured a drink on her face. He forgot that once you freeze, you become ice. And ice breaks whatever it touches. The elevator climbed to the 42nd floor in total silence. When the doors opened, the chaos was visceral. EtherTech employees were scurrying like ants in a flooded nest. And there, in the center of the glass-walled boardroom, stood Mark. He was shouting into a phone, his tie loosened, his face the color of raw meat. Behind him, on the giant monitor, was the countdown timer I'd shown the hitman in the laundromat. It had 4 minutes left. I walked into the boardroom. The directors, men I had hosted for dinner, men who had toasted to our beautiful life, all turned to look at me. They looked at me as if I were a ghost. Mark dropped his phone. It clattered on the mahogany table. "Julia? What the hell are you doing here? I told you to stay at the house." "The house is a crime scene, Mark," I said. My voice carried across the room, cutting through the panic. "And I think everyone here deserves to know why." I walked to the head of the table. I didn't ask for permission. I sat in the chairman's chair. "Gentlemen," I said, looking at the board. "My husband has likely told you that the recent leaks are a coordinated attack by a competitor. He's lying. The leaks are coming from me." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. Mark stepped toward me, his hands shaking. "You're insane. You're having a breakdown. Someone call security." "Security is busy, Mark," I said, pointing to the monitor. "They're currently watching the front entrance where the FBI has just pulled up. You see, I didn't just leak the code. I leaked the source of the $5 million that hit our joint account this morning. The money from Onyx Horizon." I looked at my watch. 3 minutes. One of the board members, a man named Arthur who had known my father for 30 years, stood up. "Julia, what are you saying? Are you accusing Mark of money laundering?" "I'm not accusing him, Arthur," I replied, sliding a flash drive across the table. "I'm providing the receipts. Along with the recording of Mark and his consultant, Lyra, discussing how to frame me for the entire operation. He didn't just betray the company. He betrayed the law. And he did it using your infrastructure." Mark lunged for the flash drive, but Arthur was faster. He pinned it to the table with a trembling hand. Mark turned to me, his eyes wide with a desperate, animalistic terror. He realized he wasn't just losing his company. He was losing his freedom. He leaned over the table, whispering so only I could hear. "If I go down, you go down, Julia. Onyx won't let you walk away. They're in this room. They're everywhere." I leaned in, my breath hitting his ear just as his head hit mine on Christmas Day. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Mark," I whispered. "But the men in the silver sedan? The ones who were following me. They've been detained for reckless driving and possession of unlicensed firearms 2 blocks away. My security team is much better than yours." I stood up and looked at the board. "You have 2 minutes before that timer hits 0 and the files go public. If you vote to remove Mark as CEO right now, and if you turn over his private server to the authorities voluntarily, I might delay the release of the documents that implicate the board's negligence." I was testing them. I wanted to see if they would choose the captain or the ship. In the valley, the ship always wins. Arthur looked at the other members. They didn't even look at Mark. They looked at the timer. 1:45, 1:44. Arthur cleared his throat. "I move for an emergency vote to remove Mark Sterling as CEO and chairman, effective immediately." "Seconded," 3 voices said in unison. Mark looked around the room, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He was the king of a kingdom that had just vanished. But then, he did something I didn't expect. He laughed. A high, shrill sound. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, black remote. "You think I didn't have a kill switch for the servers, Julia? If I don't leave this building as CEO, no one leaves with the data. I'll wipe the entire company. We'll all be paupers by lunch." I stayed perfectly still. The board members gasped. But I just looked at the remote. And then I looked at the hidden camera I knew Lyra was watching from. The boardroom felt like the inside of a vacuum. Mark stood there, his thumb hovering over the red button on the remote, his eyes manic. He looked like a man who had finally realized the only way to win a game of chess was to flip the table. "One press, Julia," he hissed. 10 years of your status, our daughter's inheritance, the pensions of 300 employees, gone. I built this world. I can burn it. I looked at him, and for a fleeting second, I felt a flicker of the old Julia, the one who would have begged him to think of our child. But that Julia had died in a puddle of scotch. "Go ahead, Mark," I said. My voice was a whisper, but in that silent room, it sounded like a thunderclap. "Press it." Mark's thumb twitched. The board members looked like they were about to vomit. Arthur reached out a hand, pleading, "Mark, let's talk about this." "No," I interrupted, stepping closer to my husband. "He's bluffing. Because Mark doesn't know how to destroy things. He only knows how to steal them." Mark roared and slammed his thumb down on the button. We all waited for the screens to go black. We waited for the sirens of the server rooms to scream. But nothing happened. The monitor behind him didn't flicker. The lights stayed on. Mark pressed it again, frantically, his face turning a shade of purple I'd never seen. "It's not working because you don't own the servers anymore, Mark," I said. "You haven't owned them since 3 o'clock this morning." I gestured to the door. It didn't open for the FBI. It opened for a woman. She was tall, wearing a tailored navy suit, her hair pulled back in a silver-flecked bun. She didn't look like a mistress. She didn't look like a Lyra. She looked like an auditor. Mark froze. "Evelyn?" "Hello, Mark," she said. Her voice was the one I'd heard on the recordings, the smooth, cold silk. But the way she looked at him wasn't with love. It was with the practiced boredom of a predator looking at an ant. "Gentlemen," I said to the board, "I believe you've met my husband's consultant. But you haven't met the real Evelyn Thorne. She isn't just a shell company manager. She's the chief liquidator for the SEC's undercover task force." The room erupted. Mark collapsed into his chair, the remote clattering to the floor. The major betrayal I thought I had discovered, the affair, the plan to kill me, it was only half the truth. Lyra, Evelyn, had been playing Mark for years. She hadn't been helping him steal the money. She had been documenting every single cent he took, waiting for him to reach the $5 million threshold that turned a corporate crime into a federal racketeering case. And the most bitter pill of all? I was the one who had invited her into our lives. I looked at Evelyn. 3 years ago, I had suspected Mark was skimming. I didn't have the tools to prove it, so I had reached out to an old contact in D.C. I had provided the in. I had suggested she use the name Lyra, the name of his ex, knowing his ego wouldn't be able to resist the nostalgia. I had been the architect of his downfall long before the Christmas party. But I had forgotten one crucial thing: in a sting operation, everyone is a target until the cuffs are on. "Julia," Evelyn said, walking toward me. She didn't offer a hand. "I need you to step away from the table. As of 5 minutes ago, this building and all assets associated with the Sterling estate are under federal seizure." "Including my trust?" I asked, my heart finally skipping a beat. "Including your trust," she replied. "We found the 1099 misc Mark filed. Until we can prove you weren't complicit in the Onyx Horizon transfers, you're a person of interest." I looked at Mark. He was weeping now. Not for me. Not for our daughter. For himself. He looked at me, and through his tears, he gave me a smile that was pure venom. "If I'm going to a cage, Julia," he wheezed, "at least I'm taking you with me. We're finally partners again." I realized then that my victory was hollow. I had dismantled Mark, but in the process, I had given the government the rope to hang me too. I had played the game so well that I'd trapped myself. But as the agents began to lead Mark away, Evelyn leaned in and dropped a small, crumpled piece of paper onto the mahogany table. The offshore account isn't empty, the note read. But it's not in your name or his. Look at the beneficiary. I waited until the room cleared. I waited until the sound of Mark's sobbing faded down the hallway. I picked up the paper. My hands, which had been steady through the scotch, through the SUV chase, through the confrontation, finally began to shake. I opened the digital portal one last time. I checked the secondary beneficiary for the Lirotech account, the one that held the $5 million that was supposed to be my treason money. It wasn't Mark. It wasn't me. It was my daughter. And the account had been opened on the day she was born, by a third party. My father. My father hadn't left me a trust he thought Mark could steal. He had created a ghost account, a honeypot, designed to lure a greedy man in and trap him the moment he tried to touch it. He had known, even back then, what kind of man Mark was. He hadn't just protected the money. He had built a guillotine and waited for Mark to put his head in it. I sat in the empty boardroom, the sun reflecting off the glass towers of Silicon Valley. I was broke. I was a person of interest in a federal case. I was a mother with no home. But as I looked at the account balance, I saw a final message in the memo line of the transfer, written years ago by a man who was no longer here. For Julia. When the ice melts. The war wasn't over. But for the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was free. I picked up the phone. It was time to call the one person Mark feared more than the FBI, his mother. The boardroom was empty, save for the ghost of Mark's ego and the scent of his expensive, panicked sweat. I stood at the window, looking out over the valley. From up here, the world looks like a circuit board, and everyone on the street is just a pulse of electricity. I was officially a person of interest. In the eyes of the law, I was the wife of a traitor. In the eyes of the public, I was a socialite whose golden cage had just turned into a prison. But they didn't understand the geography of my father's mind. He didn't just build wealth, he built fortifications. I picked up the phone. I didn't call a lawyer. Lawyers are for people who want to follow the rules. I called my mother-in-law, Martha. Martha was a woman who smelled of Chanel No. 5 and old money, the kind of money that doesn't scream, but whispers and gets exactly what it wants. She had always looked at me like I was a temporary fixture in Mark's life. Today, I was going to remind her that I was the one holding the deed to her son's soul. Martha, I said when she answered. My voice was a blade. Turn on the news. Your son is being led out of Ethertech in handcuffs. The silence on the other end was brittle. Julia, what have you done? I didn't do anything, Martha. Mark did. He tried to frame me for treason to cover his debts to Onyx Horizon. But here's the problem, he used the honeypot account my father set up. The one that's tied to your family's foundation. I heard a sharp intake of breath. The Sterling Foundation was the only thing Martha cared about. If it was touched by a federal investigation into foreign money laundering, the Sterling name would be erased from every museum wing and hospital board in the country. What do you want? She whispered. The visionary's mother sounded small. Defeated. I want my daughter, I said. And I want the testimony Mark's lawyer is hiding in the safe at your estate. The one where Mark admits he forged my signature on the prenup. Give me those, and I'll make sure the feds think the foundation was a victim of Mark's fraud, not a co-conspirator. Negotiating with a shark is easy when you're the one holding the blood. An hour later, I was standing in front of the Sterling estate in Woodside. The iron gates, which usually stayed shut for me, swung open. Martha was waiting on the terrace. My daughter, Sophie, was in the garden, oblivious to the fact that her father was currently in a holding cell and her mother was a federal suspect. I didn't look at Martha. I walked straight to Sophie, pulled her into my arms, and held her until I could feel her heartbeat against mine. "Is Daddy coming home?" she asked, her voice muffled against my suit. "Daddy's going on a long trip, Sophie," I said, my voice thick with a lie that tasted like iron. "But you and we're going to start something new." I turned back to Martha. She handed me an envelope. It wasn't just the testimony. It was a list of every board member at Onyx Horizon. Martha had been their silent partner for decades. She hadn't been protecting Mark, she had been protecting the system that allowed men like Mark to exist. "You're a monster, Julia," Martha said, her eyes cold as flint. "I learned from the best," I replied. "You taught me that family is a business. I'm just conducting a hostile takeover." I walked to my car with Sophie. But as I opened the door, a man stepped out from the shadows of the hedges. It wasn't an agent. It wasn't a hitman. It was Arthur, the board member from EtherTech. He looked pale, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Julia, wait," he said. "You don't understand what you've unleashed. Evelyn Thorne, she isn't just SEC. She's working for a different branch." "The $5 million? It's not money, Julia. It's a key. And now that you've touched it, they won't let you stop until the entire system is dismantled." I looked at Arthur. I looked at the envelope in my hand. The exit strategy wasn't just about a divorce. It wasn't just about insurance. It was a massive, multi-layered trap designed to expose the Shadow Valley, the hidden economy that fueled the tech giants. Mark had been a pawn. Lyra had been a knight. And I was the queen being used to checkmate the king. I realized then that winning meant I could never go back. I couldn't go back to the parties, the silk dresses, or the beautiful, empty silence of the mansion. I looked at Sophie, buckled into her seat, playing with a toy. "Arthur," I said, my voice ringing with a new kind of power. "Tell them I'm ready to talk. But tell them the price just went up. I don't want my innocence. I want the seat at the head of the table. I want Onyx Horizon's assets liquidated into a trust for the people they've stepped on." Arthur stared at me as if I had grown a second head. "You're asking for a revolution, Julia." "No," I said, putting the car into gear. "I'm asking for a refund. And tell Evelyn Thorne. I know she's listening through the car's Bluetooth. I have the second ledger. The one my father didn't tell Mark about. If she wants it, she meets me at the bridge at midnight. Alone. We're at the edge of the bridge now. Some of you have watched me lose my home, my husband, and almost my mind. You've stayed for the carnage. But if you're still sitting there without subscribing, if you're just a tourist in my ruins, then I want you to go to the comments. Tell me why you think I should have stayed in that wet dress and stayed silent. Tell me why you're afraid of the woman I've become. I'm watching you, just like they're watching me. Midnight in Northern California doesn't hide the truth, it just makes the lies harder to see. I drove toward the Dumbarton Bridge, the headlights cutting through a fog so thick it felt like driving into a cloud of ash. Sophie was safe. I had left her with the only person I still trusted, my childhood nanny, the woman who had warned me about the federal investigation. She was miles away now, tucked into a quiet farmhouse in the valley. I was alone in the car, the second ledger sitting on the passenger seat like a live grenade. My father had been a man of shadows, but he was a shadow with a conscience. The second ledger wasn't just a list of Mark's thefts. It was a map. A map of the Shadow Valley. It detailed how companies like Onyx Horizon weren't just investing in tech, they were using tech companies as laundromats for geopolitical power. I was about to pull the thread that would unravel a dozen multi-billion-dollar empires. I pulled over at the designated lookout. A lone figure stood by the railing, silhouetted against the flickering lights of the bay. It was Evelyn Thorne. But she wasn't wearing her auditor's suit. She was wearing a heavy tactical coat, and her hand was resting on the grip of a holstered weapon. As I stepped out of the car, I saw 3 other sets of headlights flicker on in the distance. We weren't alone. I told you to come alone, Evelyn, I said, my voice cutting through the wind. I am alone, Julia, she replied, not turning around. The cars behind you aren't mine. They're the dominoes. They know what's in that ledger. They know that if you hand it to me, the stock market opens tomorrow to a bloodbath. I looked back. The cars were stationary, watching us like vultures. I turned back to Evelyn. Then let's give them a show. I walked to her and handed her the ledger. She opened it, flicking a small penlight across the pages. I watched her face. For the first time, the chief liquidator looked genuinely afraid. My God, she whispered. It's not just Mark. It's the entire board of the Venture Capital Union. It's the infrastructure of the smart city contracts. Julia, if I process this, the power grid in 3 states will technically be under criminal seizure. Process it, I said. You don't understand, Evelyn said, looking at me with wide eyes. The moment this enters the system, Mark's accident timeline becomes a global priority. They will burn the world to keep this quiet. I leaned against the cold railing. They already tried to burn me, Evelyn. They used a glass of scotch and a frame job. I'm already ash. And you know what they say about ash, it's the only thing that doesn't burn. Suddenly, my phone, the mirrored one, began to scream with notifications. I looked down. The dominoes were falling faster than I'd planned. Ethertecha's stock had been frozen. 2 of the board members I'd seen this morning had just resigned via emergency press releases. But there was one notification that stopped my breath. A news alert: explosion reported at the Sterling estate in Woodside. Casualties unknown. Martha. The Shadow Valley had struck back. They hadn't gone for me. They had gone for the woman who knew too much. They had gone for the Sterling name. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a terrifying, crystalline calm. I looked at Evelyn. The countdown timer didn't just send files to the SEC. It sent a live stream link to a private server. If I don't check in every 30 minutes, the passwords to the encrypted cloud, the one holding the bank codes for the Onyx Horizon offshore accounts, get posted to the dark web. Evelyn's radio crackled. Alpha lead, we have a breach. The Ethertech servers are being wiped from an external location. We're losing the trail. No, you're not, I said, stepping closer to her. I'm the trail. Mark was the distraction. Martha was the insurance. But I'm the one with the keys to the vault. Tell your other branch that if they want the money back, the $50 billion Onyx has been moving, they protect my daughter. And they do it now. I was no longer a victim of a crime. I was the architect of a catastrophe. I watched as Evelyn spoke into her radio, her voice frantic. I watched as the cars behind us sped away, realizing the game had shifted. They weren't hunting a wife anymore, they were chasing a ghost who could bankrupt them with a single text message. I got back into my car. I didn't wait for Evelyn to finish. I had one stop left. A small, nondescript office in a strip mall near the airport. It was the headquarters of the Lyra Shell Company. The place where Mark and Lyra, Evelyn, had met to plan my downfall. I knew there was a safe there. And I knew the code. But as I pulled into the parking lot, I saw a familiar Tesla parked in the corner. The driver's side door was open. And sitting on the pavement, covered in blood and clutching a bottle of scotch, was Mark. He had escaped. I have no idea about it, I muttered to myself as I stepped out of the car. Mark looked up at me. His eyes were empty. The visionary was gone. There was only a broken man left in the neon light of a strip mall. You won, Julia, he croaked, raising the bottle in a mocking toast. You killed it all. The company, the house, my mother, are you happy now? I walked up to him and kicked the bottle out of his hand. It shattered against the asphalt, the smell of scotch filling the air one last time. I'm not happy, Mark, I said, looking down at him with nothing but pity. I'm finished. I reached into his pocket and pulled out the keycard he'd used to escape. I didn't call the police. I didn't call Evelyn. I walked toward the office door. The FBI is 10 minutes behind me, Mark. If I were you, I'd start running. But then again, you never were very good at the exit strategy, were you? I swiped the card and the door clicked open. Inside, the monitors were still glowing. And on the main screen, a video was playing on a loop. It was the Christmas party. The moment the scotch hit my face. But the camera angle was different. It wasn't from a phone. It was from the perspective of the person standing right behind Mark. The person who had handed him the glass. The office was cold. Not just the temperature, but the atmosphere, the kind of cold that feels like it's trying to preserve a corpse. I stood in front of the monitors, my eyes fixed on the footage of that Christmas afternoon. The video was high definition, crystal clear. I watched myself freeze. I watched the scotch drip. But I wasn't looking at me anymore. I was looking at the sleeve of the person who had handed Mark the glass. It was a cashmere sleeve, charcoal gray, with a very specific cufflink, a small, silver compass. A gift I had bought for my father on his 60th birthday. I felt the floor drop out from under me. My father was dead. He had died 2 years ago in a boating accident off the coast of Monterey. Or so I had been told. I reached out and touched the screen. The hand belonged to Arthur. The family friend. The man who had stood by me in the boardroom. The man who had whispered about the Shadow Valley. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Arthur hadn't been protecting me. He hadn't been my father's loyal associate. He was the architect. Mark was the puppet, Lyra was the agent, but Arthur was the one who had pulled the strings from the very beginning. The door behind me clicked shut. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I could smell the faint scent of his pipe tobacco, the same scent that had filled my father's library for decades. You were always too observant for your own good, Julia, Arthur said. His voice wasn't the trembling, fatherly tone from this morning. It was sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of empathy. You killed him, I said. I didn't ask. I knew. I liberated him, Arthur replied, walking into the light of the monitors. He looked different now. The kindly uncle mask had been discarded, leaving behind something hollow and metallic. Your father was a sentimentalist, Julia. He built the honeypot to protect you, yes. But he didn't realize that the honeypot was the most valuable asset in the Shadow Valley. He wouldn't sell. So, he had to be removed. I turned to face him. He was holding a small, silver device, a signal jammer. The recording, I said, gesturing to the screen. Why keep it? Arthur smiled, a thin, ghastly line. Because it was the moment I knew I had one. I told Mark to do it. I told him it would break your spirit, make you pliable for the frame job. I wanted to see the look on your face when the man you loved destroyed you. It's a hobby of mine, watching the exact moment a person loses their soul. And Mark? I asked. He's outside. He's a wreck. Mark is a failed experiment, Arthur said, dismissively. He was supposed to lead you to the gallows. Instead, he led you to the truth. Which means I have to clean up the mess myself. I looked at the monitors. Behind Arthur, the Shadow Valley map was still glowing. The billions of dollars, the shell companies, the geopolitical leverage, it all flowed through him. You think you can just kill me? I asked. Evelyn Thorne is on her way. The FBI is 10 minutes out. Evelyn Thorne works for me, Julia, Arthur said. The world stopped. I thought of the bridge. I thought of handing her the ledger. I thought of the other branch. Did you really think the government wasn't part of the system? Arthur laughed. Evelyn isn't here to arrest me. She's here to retrieve the ledger you so graciously handed her. The one that contains the only evidence of my involvement. You didn't give the keys to the vault to the heroes, Julia. You gave them back to the bank. I didn't panic. I didn't scream. I actually felt a strange sense of relief. You're right, Arthur, I said, walking toward him. I did give her the ledger. And I'm sure she's very happy with it. I pulled my burner phone from my pocket. It wasn't blocked by his jammer. Because it wasn't a phone. But I didn't give her the real ledger, I whispered. I gave her a decoy. A map of empty accounts and dead-end leads. The real data, the metadata of your involvement, the recordings of you and Mark, and the proof of what happened to my father, is currently being uploaded to a satellite relay. Arthur's face paled. You're lying. I have no idea about it, I said, repeating the phrase that had become my armor. Unless, of course, you're talking about the kill switch I activated the moment I swiped the card to enter this room. Look at the screen behind you, Arthur. The monitors were no longer showing the Christmas party. They were showing a global distribution list. Thousands of names. Journalists, activists, rival hedge funds, and foreign ministries. I didn't wait for the FBI, I said. I didn't wait for a fair trial. I realized that in your world, the only justice is total exposure. The Shadow Valley isn't just falling, Arthur. It's being mapped in real time for the entire world to see. The progress bars hit 100%. A single, loud ping echoed through the office. Arthur lunged for me, his hands reaching for my throat, but the sound of heavy boots shattered the front window. It wasn't Evelyn Thorne. It wasn't the FBI. It was a group of people in plain clothes, carrying cameras and laptops. The independent press. The ones I had contacted from the laundromat. The ones who couldn't be bought by the Shadow Valley because they didn't live in it, I stepped back as the flashes began to pop. Arthur tried to hide his face, but it was too late. He was no longer a shadow. He was a headline. I walked past him, out into the cool night air. Mark was still sitting by his Tesla, staring at the ground. He looked at me as I passed, his mouth opening as if to say something. Don't, I said. I have no idea who you are. I got into my car and drove away. I didn't look back at the sirens, the lights, or the ruins of the empire. I drove toward the farmhouse. I drove toward Sophie. But as I reached the quiet dirt road leading to the farm, I saw a single car parked in the driveway. A charcoal gray sedan. And sitting on the porch, holding a glass of milk for my daughter, was a man I hadn't seen in 2 years. My father. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a victim. He was the one who had sent the nanny. He was the one who had guided me through the maze. And as he looked up and smiled, I realized the honeypot wasn't a trap for Mark. It was a test for me. The gravel crunched beneath my tires, a grounding, visceral sound that felt at odds with the sight before me. I didn't turn off the engine. The headlights stayed on, bathing the porch in a harsh, white glow. My father sat there, a shadow in a cardigan, his face weathered by 2 years I hadn't been a part of. I stepped out of the car. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I walked toward the porch, my eyes searching his face for the trick, the hologram, the lie. But he smelled of the same old peppermint and cedarwood. He looked at me with eyes that weren't the eyes of a victim, but of a strategist who had just watched his final piece reach the end of the board. You were dead, I whispered. I watched them pull the wreckage of the blue iris from the water. I held Mom's hand at the funeral. I cried over an empty casket for 700 days. I know, Julia, he said. His voice was raspy, older than I remembered. And every day was a debt I knew I'd have to pay back. But if I hadn't died, Arthur would have killed us both. He was already poisoning the accounts. He was already grooming Mark. I had to become a ghost to keep you from becoming a corpse. He stood up, his joints popping, and reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a compass cufflink. He pulled out a small, encrypted key, the physical twin to the one I had just used to dismantle the Shadow Valley. But I didn't just hide, Julia. I watched. I watched you at the Christmas party. I was the one who recorded it. Not from the perspective of Arthur's ally, but from the perspective of his executioner. I stopped at the bottom step. The betrayal I felt wasn't against Mark or Arthur anymore. It was against the man standing in front of me. You watched, I said, the words tasting like ash. You watched him pour that drink on my face. You watched me freeze. You watched me spiral for months, losing my house, my status, my safety, and you did nothing? I did everything, he replied, his gaze unwavering. I sent the nanny. I leaked the first ledger to your burner identity. I ensured Evelyn Thorne was assigned to the case. I gave you the tools, Julia. But I couldn't give you the will. If I had stepped in, you would have been a protected witness for the rest of your life. I didn't want you protected. I wanted you powerful. He walked to the edge of the porch, looking down at me. The Shadow Valley isn't a place you can hide from. You either own it, or it owns you. I needed to know if my daughter was a sterling, or if she was something more. The honeypot hadn't been for the money. It had been for the transformation. He had sacrificed my peace to build my armor. The Christmas Day humiliation wasn't just a catalyst for revenge, it was the final exam. I felt a coldness settle in my chest that eclipsed everything Mark had ever done. So, Arthur was right, I said. It was a hobby. Watching the moment a soul breaks. No, my father said, stepping down to my level. It was about watching the moment the soul hardens into a diamond. And now, you hold the switch to the entire network. Arthur is gone. Mark is broken. But the seat at the head of the table is still warm. And it belongs to you. I looked at the house. I could see Sophie through the window, sleeping peacefully. She was the reason I had fought. But now I realized she was the reason I had been fought over. You didn't do this for me, I said, my voice as steady as a flatline. You did this for the legacy. You used me to clean up the mess you and Arthur made 40 years ago. My father didn't deny it. He just tilted his head, the same way I had tilted mine at Mark. The world needs architects, Julia. We can go inside, wake Sophie, and vanish. Or, we can take the flight I have waiting at the private terminal. The one that goes to the board meeting in Zurich. The one where they're waiting to meet the new Shadow of the Valley. I looked at the key in his hand. I looked at the car I had driven here in, a car filled with evidence, trauma, and a ruined silk dress. I realized the final twist wasn't about who lived or died. It was about the fact that I had become exactly what I was fighting. I was calculated. I was cold. I was the woman who had just bankrupted thousands to save herself. I reached out and took the key. But I didn't put it in my pocket. I walked back to my car, pulled the first ledger, the decoy, from the seat, and tossed it at his feet. I'm going to Zurich, I said. But not with you. And not as your legacy. Julia, he called out, his voice finally showing a crack of fear. I have no idea who you are, I said, stepping into the driver's seat. But the FBI is 10 minutes behind me. And I didn't just leak Arthur's involvement. I leaked the coordinates of a certain boating accident in Monterey. If you want to be a ghost, Dad, you're about to get your wish. I put the car in reverse and swung it around. I didn't look back at him. I didn't look at the farmhouse. I drove toward the terminal, not for the power, but for the final move on the board. The hunt wasn't over. But the predator had finally changed her name. Zurich in January is a city of granite and glass, where the air is so sharp it feels like it could cut your lungs. It is the place where the world's secrets go to be laundered into silence. People don't shout here. They don't pour drinks on faces. They destroy you with a decimal point and a polite nod across a mahogany table. I sat in the back of a black Mercedes, watching the Limmat River flow beneath the bridges. My daughter, Sophie, was safe, not with my father, and not with the Sterlings. I had placed her in a private villa in the Alps with a security detail that reported only to me. For the first time in 10 years, no man knew where my heart was hidden. I looked at my reflection in the tinted glass. The woman who had been soaked in scotch on Christmas Day was gone. In her place was someone I barely recognized, someone whose eyes were as gray and unyielding as the Swiss sky. I wasn't here to be a shadow. I was here to be the auditor. The car stopped in front of a nondescript stone building with no sign on the door. This was the headquarters of the Gnomes of Zurich, the silent partners of the Shadow Valley. As I stepped out, a man in a gray suit approached me. He didn't offer a hand. He offered a tablet. The board is waiting, Madame Sterling. Or should I say, Madame Lyra? I walked into the boardroom. It was circular, designed so that no one sat at the head, but we all knew where the power was. The 10 men and 3 women at the table didn't look like villains. They looked like grandfathers and philanthropists. They were the ones who had funded Mark's ego and Arthur's greed. They were the ones who had profited from my father's death. Julia, one of the men said, his accent thick and Swiss. You've caused quite a disturbance in the markets. The SEC is breathing down our necks, and the Onyx Horizon accounts are frozen. We were told you had a solution. I sat down and placed the key, the one my father had given me, in the center of the table. The solution is simple, I said, my voice echoing in the stone room. You are going to liquidate the Shadow Valley. Every shell company, every offshore honeypot, every debt trap you've set in Silicon Valley. You're going to fold them into a new entity. A transparent one. The laughter was soft, but it was there. And why would we do that? We have the lawyers to fight the SEC for 20 years. You have, what? A ledger? I don't have a ledger, I said, leaning forward. I have the kill switch protocols. My father built the system, but he forgot that I'm the one who lived in the house. I know the back doors he didn't even know existed. If you don't agree to the liquidation, I don't just leak the files. I trigger the toxification sequence. The room went perfectly still. Toxification. It was the nuclear option. It didn't just expose the money, it corrupted the data, making the billions of dollars in those accounts untraceable and unusable to everyone, including them. I was threatening to turn the world's most powerful bank accounts into digital garbage. You'd be a pauper, Julia, a woman at the end of the table whispered. You'd lose everything. I already lost everything on Christmas Day, I replied. You can't threaten a woman who has already seen the bottom of the glass. I watched them exchange looks. They saw the truth in my eyes. I wasn't bluffing. I didn't care about the silk dresses anymore. I didn't care about the mansion. I cared about the clean slate. What do you want in return? The chairman asked. Total immunity for my daughter, I said. A complete scrubbing of my name from the federal investigation. And I want Mark Sterling's location. I know you moved him out of the U.S. before the FBI could process the warrant. I didn't want him for revenge. Not the kind you see in movies. I wanted him to see what I had built from the ruins he left behind. The chairman nodded slowly. He slid a folder toward me. He's in a safe house in Montenegro. He thinks he's waiting for us to restart his company. He has no idea the company no longer exists. I took the folder. And my father? Your father is handled, the chairman said. The authorities in Monterey found the new evidence you provided. He won't be bothering you again. He's a ghost now, for real this time. I walked out of that building a billionaire, a ghost, and a sovereign power all at once. But as I stood on the bridge over the limb mat, watching the snow fall into the dark water, I didn't feel victorious. I felt quiet. Rebuilding power isn't about the noise of the hunt. It's about the silence of the aftermath. It's about being able to walk down a street and know that no one, not a husband, not a father, not a shadow, owns your next breath. I opened my phone. There was a message from the nanny. A video of Sophie throwing a snowball, laughing as it hit a tree. I have no idea about it, I said to the wind. I wasn't talking about the crimes anymore. I was talking about the pain. I was choosing to forget the sting of the scotch. I was choosing to let the ice melt. I hailed a taxi. The airport, I told the driver. But as we pulled away, I saw a reflection in the rearview mirror. A man in a charcoal gray coat, standing by the river. He didn't move. He just watched the car go. He didn't have a silver compass cufflink. But he had the same posture as the man from the Christmas party. I didn't tell the driver to stop. I didn't look back. The game was over. And even if the shadows remained, they were no longer mine to fight. Montenegro is where the mountains meet the sea in a jagged embrace. It is a place of ancient stone and deep water, far from the neon hum of Silicon Valley and the sterile cold of Zurich. I stood on the balcony of a small villa overlooking the Adriatic. The air didn't smell like ozone or expensive tobacco. It smelled of salt, rosemary, and thyme. I had one final piece of business. One last mirror to look into before I could let the curtain fall on the story of Julia Sterling. I walked down the winding stone path to the guest cottage at the edge of the property. The man inside didn't hear me approach. He was sitting on a wooden chair, staring at a patch of sunlight on the floor. He looked smaller than I remembered. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his hair was thinning, and his hands, the hands that once held the power of a tech empire, were gripped tightly around a cheap glass of local brandy. I stepped into the doorway. Mark didn't jump. He didn't even look up at first. "The Swiss sent you to finish it?" he asked. His voice was a hollow shell of the man who had toasted his success on Christmas Day. "The Swiss don't care about you anymore, Mark," I said. "No one does. You're a ghost in a beautiful place. That's your sentence." He finally looked at me. There was no anger left in him, only a pathetic, desperate confusion. "Why did you come here, Julia? To gloat? To see me like this?" "I came to give you something," I said. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, framed photo. It was the only thing I had kept from the mansion. It wasn't a photo of us. It was the photo of the orange I had sliced in the kitchen, the one where the knife had cut deep into the wood. I set the photo on the table next to his brandy. "I wanted you to see the moment I became real," I whispered. "For 10 years, I was a reflection of what you wanted. A perfect wife. A perfect hostess. A perfect target. But when you poured that scotch on my face, you didn't break the reflection. You broke the mirror. And the woman underneath, she was never yours to own." Mark looked at the photo, then back at me. "I loved you, Julia. In my own way." "No," I said, and for the first time, I felt no sting in the words. "You loved the audience. You loved the way I made you look. But love doesn't build a timeline for an accident. Love doesn't frame a mother for treason." I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me one last time. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. You have the money. You have the power. You're just like Arthur now. You're just like your father. I stopped at the door, the sun warming my back. I looked out at the horizon where the blue of the sea met the blue of the sky. I have no idea about it, I said. But this time, it wasn't a lie. It wasn't a tactical denial. It was the truth. For the first time in my life, I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a ledger. I didn't have a strategy. I was just Julia. I walked away from the cottage, leaving him there with his brandy and his shadows. I walked down to the beach where Sophie was playing in the sand. She looked up and waved, her smile bright and untainted by the war we had just survived. I sat down beside her and let the water wash over my feet. The cold didn't make me freeze. It made me feel alive. People ask about the moral of the story. They want to know if revenge is sweet. They want to know if the fire was worth the ash. The moral isn't that you should fight fire with fire. It's that you should know when the house you're living in is already burning. I stayed because I thought silence was safety. I stayed because I thought my value was tied to the man standing next to me. The scotch wasn't a tragedy. It was a baptism. I realized that power isn't something someone gives you. It isn't a seat at a table in Zurich or a number in a Cayman account. Power is the ability to stand in the middle of your own ruins and say, I am still here. I looked at the waves. The Shadow Valley would find new kings. New puppet masters would emerge from the fog. But they would never find me. Because I had learned the ultimate secret of the game, the only way to truly win is to stop playing. My name is Julia. I was a victim. I was a vengeful architect. I was a shadow. But today, I am just a woman watching her daughter play in the sun. And I have no idea how beautiful that would feel. The story is finished. I've laid my life bare so you could see the cost of silence and the weight of a mask. If you're leaving now, if you're closing this video without subscribing, then you're choosing to walk back into your own shadows without a guide. If you won't join me, go to the comments. Tell the others why you're choosing to stay a spectator in your own life. Tell us why you're afraid to see what's under your own mask. I'm moving on, will you?